It's like, why can't I get my mouse off of the screen? Because I'm an idiot. All right. Go live. Go live. Why this is a challenge every time. It's like I've never done it before. There we go. All right. So. Hey, it's all up there. All right. So this is where we ended last time, if I'm correct, which I checked the video last time. This is where it was at last time, so I believe this is where we're going to end. We have just a little bit left in terms of the chapter, and then we're going to move on to chapter 5, so good enough. The end of the Great Awakening, the critiques of the established clergy, James Davenport in particular, saying that people in Boston should drink rat poison rather than listen to corrupt, unconverted clergy, and then ended up getting silenced by angry officials at a grand jury. Others, such as Tennant, who we mentioned before, reuniting certain groups rather than breaking them up, which had kind of been the theme of the Great Awakening. While it had helped to spread religious fervor, it was more about division than unity. It was about dividing the established groups from those who were poor and disenfranchised, kind of an us versus them mentality, which we'll get more into a little bit later. So, I think I have already put this on Blackboard. If not, I'll definitely have it up today. And there's that image of Whitefield, Dr. Squintum. That was very mean because he was cross-eyed. And his various followers and the things going on there. It's actually at the end of the chapter in the book. So, while the all of that was going on, there were, of course, political changes that were happening as well. Most settlements were easily regulated, which is to say they were being run by rich white men. As the expansion continued westward and the population continued to grow, it became harder to maintain this hold, just like we saw with Boston, where when the Puritans arrived in North America and they had Boston, it was like, okay, well, we've got this little township, we've got the settlement set up in this particular zone, and this is how it is. But as it grew, and it grew quickly, they had to begin making new laws and new rules for how things would be set up outside of Boston, because you couldn't just cram everybody in Boston. In particular, it was the royal authority versus local authority. Technically, the ultimate authority lay with Parliament and the king, and they would appoint royal officials who could come over and veto whatever the locally appointed officials had decided. But that was a little bit difficult. It took, a month to get across the Atlantic and a month to get back. So any amount of, decision making was very far removed. And that's assuming that, someone sent a message over to Britain, they immediately made a decision, which you know how quickly elected bodies make decisions, and then sent the decision back. That's still 2 months to get word back. And also, London is not the American colonies. Um, London is a town on a river, well, a city on a river, that's been industrialized really even before the Industrial Revolution was a thing. Cobblestone, I mean, it was one of the first cities in England, and it was a Viking city. Um, and decisions they were making there weren't necessarily possible in what was essentially the wilderness of North America. And also with the North Americans being, the colonists, I should say, being left alone for so long, um, they had been used to their town meetings, representative bodies, the House of Burgesses, as we'd seen in Virginia. Um, they weren't really keen to just roll over and let the royal officials come in and do whatever they wanted, especially when what they wanted to do sounded like a bad idea. Meanwhile, the British officials just figured that they'd come in and tell the colonists what to do, and the colonists would just do what they said. That's what they were used to. I mean, again, the British had colonies all over the world. I may have a British Empire map later on, but there's a phrase, the sun never sets on the empire wide, part of the Hail Britannia song. And yeah, Britain ends up having bits and pieces of land all over the world to the point that it's always daylight somewhere in the British Empire. However, as we saw in this chapter and previous, we had events, individuals, and of course the religious fervor that didn't go so well with this strict royal authority. We had Roger Williams and Hutchinson, Stoner Rebellion, Salem witch trials, and then of course folks like James Davenport, who were less reliable when it came to just following authority. And this wasn't even like royal authority. This was the local authority that they chafed against. Now, all of this was, for the most part, widespread. Roger Williams and Hutchinson were one right after the other, and technically the Salem witch trials were in the same place that Roger Williamson and Hutchinson came from, but they were pretty far apart in terms of time. But it does show that the colonies were not nearly as orderly as the British would have liked. Things were a little bit wild over here in North America. A little bit unruly. I don't know if it's Davenport or Davenport. Doesn't really matter. So again, there's the population increase. Again, mostly around the Chesapeake and Northeast, the New England area. Eventually you have Charleston and Savannah, and gradually they start moving inland, but that's something we'll get into greater detail a little bit later. All right. So, protests against the elites was not uncommon in the colonies and only increased, only increased after the 1730s. A common reason was bread because, well, people could barely afford to eat anyway, and if you raise the price of bread, that's just making it so people can't afford to eat. 1730s in particular, the price of bread rose while grain prices dropped, which meant that people were having to pay more while also making less because most people were wheat farmers. So they were selling grain to try to survive. So they're making less while also having to pay more to eat. Most of these protests were led by women because women were the ones usually going out and purchasing the food. And they usually worked in the short term, getting the prices dropped back to normal, at least for a little while. There was also this event in Boston, the public markets. So, Boston officials decided to charge a fee for farmers to set up stalls in their markets. Just think of, well, farmers markets today. You know, or you have the public open air markets, and you have just farmers from around the area setting up their stalls. And I'm sure today you have to pay money to be able to set up a stall. Well, back then you didn't have to, but now the Boston officials are like, well, you have to pay money to set up the stalls. And the farmers weren't making much money to begin with. And so the Bostonians, well, the farmers were petitioning the Boston officials to get rid of the fee. When they ignored it, the stalls were destroyed overnight and nobody saw a thing. Weird how that happens. Of course, that is to say, everybody was opposed to the officials, so nobody was willing to work together, or nobody was willing to speak out against the farmers because they hated the officials. So even the merchants or middle class who didn't have really any stake in what the farmers were doing didn't care to help the Bostonian officials. It's like, yeah, we didn't see anything. And finally, and this will come up, this is the most important one. This is going to come up again multiple times, even after the Revolutionary War. Impressment. Remember this term. This is drafting of colonial men into the Royal Navy by force. Now, drafting, you could say, is by force anyway, but this is like you're at the bar and a bunch of dudes kick the door down and just start dragging people out of the bar. It's like, guess what? You're in the Navy now. This was common everywhere in the empire, anywhere that was near the ocean. The Royal Navy would roll up and be like, hey, we need some sailors. Congratulations. Because Britain was constantly at war and they needed more sailors all the time. Not just because being a Navy officer got you killed in the line of duty, but because the conditions on the ships were awful and you would die just from disease. So they constantly needed more sailors. Yeah, conditions in the Royal Navy were rough. In 1747, colonists in Boston actually fought back rather than be impressed into service. We're going to see that again a little bit later on. But yeah, they rather than, oh, the Navy's here, I guess we're going to go be in the Navy now, they physically fought back against Navy officials who were trying to essentially draft them, but the term is impressment when it comes to Navy drafting. And again, this isn't just the 13 colonies. This happens all over the empire. Ireland, India, Australia, I almost said Austria. Australia, all the islands Britain had, which were many. Anywhere close to water, you could join the Royal Navy and die of dysentery. There's your bread riot. It's weird that there's like multiple art styles in this single piece. I don't know what that's about. None of the women are drawn the same. This one's in the book, I believe. Or maybe it's not. No, I'm thinking of a different one. Think of next chapter. The press gang or English liberty displayed. This actually, no, this one isn't happening in England. Anyway, this was a common way of depicting this sort of thing, and they like to do their speech bubble sideways for some reason. Yeah, so they're like dragging men off to be in the Navy, and you know the wife's begging them to stop, but they've got their truncheons like, nah, we'll break your freaking legs, back off. So yeah, we will come back to this. So keep impressment in mind. That's the important one. All right. So a lot of these protests were people sticking together against the royal elites, not just like the people who were being targeted fighting back. I'll mention that more specifically here in a minute. In New York City, actually, yeah, that's going to be in the next chapter. So a little aside for what we're going to get to in probably just a few minutes, because I'm pretty sure it's like right at the start. There was a big impressment thing happening in New York, and rather than it just being like the people who were being drafted in or being impressed fighting back, it was also like the merchants and the authority, or not the authorities, but like the officials in New York fighting back against the Navy, rather than just, you know, the ones who were being dragged off. So that was kind of a big deal. New York City, Royal Charter confirmed the city as a corporation, more voting rights for more people. There was this whole thing between Lewis Morris and Governor William Cosby. That's really actually not important. What is important is Peter Zenger. He accused Cosby, who was the royal official, of election fraud, of corruption, election fraud, and tyranny, and then got hit with libel, which was illegal even if it was the truth, because if you undermine government authority, it was illegal, even if, you know, what he said was true. And at the end of the day, Andrew Hamilton of Philadelphia, argued that truth must be used as a defense against libel, and eventually managed to get Zenger out of prison, but it didn't actually change libel law. Still, though, this is important for later law changes, especially once the British are gone, in that, like, the freedom of the press being a major important law. So you've got Peter Zenger here. being carried out on people's shoulders. Because again, the issue was that, or the big thing is that it was like a victory for speech against like royal authority, which was not easy to do. Even if it didn't change the actual law, which again is something that will come up after the War of Independence. But this is kind of where that started. So even though the people actually like running the stuff in New York, I don't really consider as important as Zenger, who was involved in the laws going on. Yeah, the book here. Jurors were willing to ignore English common law in finding Zenger innocent and to thereby set a novel legal precedent. So that's, again, a pretty big deal. Because English common law was just like, this is how we've always done it, so it's just how it's going to be. And Andrew Hamilton argued that the truth should be adequate defense against libel, because if it's the truth, then why should it be illegal? Anyway, that's it for the chapter. Political awakenings rallied people against their traditional authority figures. It brought some groups together, but also split others apart. But this wasn't like a sudden melting pot moment. This wasn't, everybody's all American now. People were still English, French, German, etc. For the most part, they were whatever colony they were in. They were from Maryland, or they were from, not really Massachusetts yet, but like Boston or Salem or New York. The colonies were still very much separate colonies. In fact, well into the Revolution and even after, they were still very separate colonies. So the distinctions between religion, class, and race very much remained. Some of these movements exacerbated them. So even though the authority in some cases did wane, what kept people from working together often stayed where it was. So while things did change, it wasn't like a major, huge revolution that changed the world all at once. But it was a step forward, at least, or it was a step. It was a movement away from where things had been. And as I'll describe some stuff a little bit later in the next chapter, while it wasn't where things are going to end up, it certainly was laying the groundwork for later stuff. That's still important. Okay, let's do chapter 5. Let me make sure that's showing up on the thing. Not you. Where is my that? Okay. It's just gotta be like that, don't you? Okay. So, chapter 5, Wars and Empires. 1750 to 1774. We're getting right up to it. So, let's begin with some action. All right. So the Albany Congress was attempting to bring together colonial leaders in the Iroquois. Um, the British were especially concerned because while they had the most settlers, the French had a lot of forts and native alliances. The Albany Congress didn't get a whole lot done because the Iroquois, as we had seen a couple of chapters ago, had suffered badly during these wars between the various European powers and just didn't want to be involved. They felt like they would be wiped out if they continued. And they weren't wrong. A lot of native tribes did work with the French because, as we'd seen, the French hadn't really had the same kind of impact as the English did on the region. You know, rather than setting up big farms and running the natives off, they mostly just had forts and did some trading. Most groups just wanted to use the Europeans against each other. They felt that a stalemate between the two overseas powers would be better than one group holding the region over the other. Because when one group's in power, they're not going to need the natives to fight for them anymore. And they're probably going to be more like the Spanish and just get rid of them. So, 1755, General Edward Braddock attempted to take Fort Duquesne. I don't even know, it's French. Duquesne probably, because most of it's French, so it's half of it silent. He did a poor job and died in the process. So good work, General Edward Braddock. The English really do like their martyrs. Also, no war was declared. This was just the English telling this dude, hey, go take this fort for us. And he did a shitty job. Also, his second in command was George Washington. So he was there. I guess that's notable for us. Right. This is about all I could find on the Albany Congress. Once again, the biggest note for me is that they always had swords, which, I mean, it was as much a like a status symbol as it was the fact that they had a weapon on them. There's Braddock doing what he did best, getting shot. And actually, before Braddock, Washington had already been attempting to fight the French and had been getting his butt kicked. So he ended up joining up with Braddock for this big push against the fort, and they did a poor job. So it was a lot of not great for the British early on. All right, on to the war proper. 1756, France and England officially declared war on each other. Austria, Russia, Sweden, Spain joined France. Prussia and Portugal joined Britain. Conflict happened in Europe, India, West Indies, and even as far as the Philippines. The book decides to call this the French and Indian War. I refuse to call this the French and Indian War. This is the 7 Years' War because A, it's a global war, and B, the British colonists had just as many native allies as the French did. So I refuse to use that name. It's the 7 Years' War. Also, the war in Europe between Austria, Russia, and mostly just Prussia was just as big and exciting as what was going on. Actually, personally, far bigger and more exciting than what was going on in North America. So, should be mentioned. Anyway, 1757, William Pitt came over to North America and made things not be garbage. Prussia kept things from falling apart in Europe. This is something we talk about in my 104 class. It's one of my favorite parts of European history because it's real interesting. Oh, by the way, if you don't know what Prussia is, it's the central core of what will become Germany. That's what Prussia is. I forgot to mention that to my Tuesday, Thursday class. I need to tell them that tomorrow, so they'll be aware. William Pitt rallied forces in North America, helped Washington take that thing again. It was renamed Pittsburgh, so thanks, William Pitt. It's your fault we have Pittsburgh. I've never been to Pittsburgh. I just know it's everybody around Pittsburgh gives Pittsburgh a hard time. So, this isn't completely correct, but it would take a little while to go into detail. Prussia managed to get Austria and Russia out of the war by suing for peace. There's so much to that. It's such an interesting story, but sadly not for this class. Russia's weird is all I'm going to say. North America, General Jeffrey Amherst captured Forts Ticonderoga and Crown Point on Lake Champlain. Oh, something else I should mention. In this war, there were a lot of, this and another war we'll talk about, at least before the end of the semester, there was a lot of naval battles on the Great Lakes, which is weird to think about. So that happened. General James Wolfe led an outnumbered force against Quebec, which apparently he never read any military strategy ever, because if you're going to take a fortified location, you never lead a similar or smaller force against it. You need to be at least 3 times their size. But no, this chucklehead decided, no, we have less forces than the people who are defending a fortified location. That's fine. He took a lot of losses and also died, but somehow managed to take Quebec, and the British won control of Canada. So good for him, I guess. He didn't live to see it. Once again, though, the British, they love their martyrs, so he's very famous in Britain because he died in the process. If you live to see your victory, you're not a true hero. Here's William Pitt. He was more of a politician than a military man, but apparently he was a decent strategist. Better strategist than Washington, probably. Washington really wasn't a great general, but he was a good morale guy. He was able to keep his troops from just up and leaving, which becomes important in 20 years' time. Okay, here's General James Wolfe being a good British soldier and dying. supposedly that's the running joke is um, the British, their their uniforms red so that if their officers get shot, they can't tell. It's like it seems like their officers get shot a lot. All right. So despite all this, the war still took another 3 years to finish up because again, it's a 7 years war. Um, in fact, there was a lot of fighting in India as well. Um, the native Indians in India actually did a lot of the fighting for the British and the French there. There's a lot of story to that too. Eventually, the war was finished with the Peace of Paris in 1763. Britain gave up some of their territory, some of the conquered territory to France, just to make the peace a bit more amicable. They gave Cuba and the Philippines back to Spain in exchange for Florida because it's like, okay, this is way out. Well, Cuba not so much, but the Philippines is way out from where we are, and Florida's right here along the East Coast. Let's just go ahead and, fill that in. Give us Florida, and we'll give you these islands. We'll give you these islands back. Since Spain joined in on the war kind of late and just long enough for Britain to beat the crap out of them, France gave Spain Louisiana. So basically, Spain now has all the land west of the Mississippi, except for like the northwest, but don't worry about that. It's a very short period of time because eventually Spain gives it back to France, but we'll deal with that in a little bit. Everything east of the Mississippi is British. Canada is now British, and a lot of the Caribbean is now British. Also, most of India is British, and as I may have mentioned before, in my time playing Empire Total War, I decided to try to do that, and that was a mistake. India's big. Now, obviously, just because we won ourselves a war doesn't mean that everything's fine and dandy. Which, once again, even with the 4X strategy video game Empire Total War, they put this in there too. Oh, we won the war. Cool. Oh, now I've got to administer all this land. Where'd all my money go? Yeah, so you've got new territory, but there's people still living there. And your people who want to move in have to deal with these people that are still living there, and they're not happy about it. And the people who are living there that are making claims to this land aren't necessarily having that claim honored because, your people who want to move in are certainly not, they don't care about that. And also, and I just stepped on my shoelace, go me, the natives who had been hostile to Britain, the ones that were working with the Spanish and the French against the British for, 100 years at least by now? Maybe 150, 200? We're now technically on British land. And they're not going anywhere. They're not going to go with the British or the French and the Spanish to wherever they're going. They're staying right where they are. They don't care that the British are supposed to be there. Doesn't mean anything to them. And finally, war's expensive. Um, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of like we have to take more land to get our money from the war we're doing, and the only way to take more land is to do more war. But the war is expensive, so we have to take more land to get more money, to make more war, to take more land, and you just end up broke. So Britain's debt has doubled over the course of this war. Granted, they've taken a lot of land, but the land doesn't just like throw money at you after you take it. You've got to administrate the land and develop it and find a way to get money out of it. Unless it's California, which was just like, oh, by the way, here's gold. Yeah, that happened. Unfortunately for Britain, they didn't find California. In fact, this was how it was. The Spanish had all of this because, again, the French gave them Louisiana. The British managed to get all of Canada. And I'm sure this line was not super peaceful, but there wasn't a lot of settlement along this line. And then the Mississippi River, which we'll see is an issue. This proclamation line, we'll talk about that in greater detail in just a little bit. Now again, I'm not going to be like, what lands were given back to Spain in exchange for Florida? Like that's too much. But the British did get basically all the East Coast, really all the way to Mississippi. All right. So needless to say, once the war was over, the settlers who had been fighting in it, because most of the people doing the fighting were the people who were already there, they were encouraged to move west and seek out the lands that the French had left. Obviously, just because the French were gone didn't mean the natives were gone, and the natives were very pissed to have the British moving in, because the British, unlike the French, once again, were not just building forts and merrily trading with the natives. They were clear-cutting land and building farms and chasing out the natives, and immediately were having ourselves big fights. Got ahead of myself. So the natives didn't appreciate it, and the settlers returned in kind. One particular event was Pontiac and the Paxton Boys. So Pontiac was an Ottawa tribe leader, followed the prophet Neilon's teachings. Neilon, let me see if I can find that real quick. Excuse me. Woo, thank you. Known as to the British as Delaware Prophet, preached that natives had been corrupted by contact with the Europeans and urged them to purify themselves by returning to their ancient traditions, abandoning white ways and reclaiming their lands. Neilon was a prophet, not a warrior, but his message inspired others, including Pontiac. So he led a series of attacks on British forts and settlements. The Paxton Boys from Paxton, Pennsylvania, attacked natives, marched on Philadelphia demanding protection. So a little bit, this was almost another Bacon's Rebellion. They just didn't burn down Pennsylvania or Philadelphia. Pontiac's forces laid siege on Detroit, soon gained the support of 18 native nations, attacked Fort Pitt and other British frontier outposts. So yeah, it was pretty rough there for a while. This eventually led to the Proclamation Line of 1763, that line I showed you on the previous slide. Basically, colonists could not settle west of the Appalachians, which pissed the colonists off because it's like, we fought in this war against the French for 7 years. I mean, the War of the Colonies wasn't quite that long. But, we won all this land and now we're not allowed to settle on it. And in particular, the Ohio River Valley is a really good place to settle and farm, and now they're not allowed to settle it there. Now, granted, it was because, well, there was a bunch of natives there, and the natives were particularly hostile against the British, and the British didn't feel like having to protect all the settlers right now because they were dealing with other stuff. But the colonists were not having it. So here's the Paxton Boys murdering some natives. And here's a slide I stole off the internet. Now this slide, apparently whoever was teaching this went really hard into the Ohio River Valley being like the point of the 7 Years' War, and I wouldn't go that far. But I would agree that the Ohio River Valley was a reason that Britain went to war with France, but there was certainly more to it than that. But as you can see, this, keep forgetting that this is online. This section is disputed, and then they take it, but then with the proclamation line, the colonists can't cross it. They can't even go down into Florida with this line, which, I mean, why would you want to go to Florida? Yeah. How did they resolve it? Interesting. Apparently the my.fmary.edu got hacked, but it's cool now. I never used that before, so it doesn't really matter. At least to me. I don't know if you guys ever have, but I got that email this morning. Alright. So, back before the war, land disputes were a common thing with the British. I mean, hell, back before they even found North America, land disputes among the British were common. Landowners and tenants had an almost feudal setup. Tenants rose up against their landlords, seeking better treatment. It was rough. A lot of them acted like things were like they were back home in Britain, where they were ancestral land holdings, and the landlord had this like almost nobility over the land, and the tenant had to do whatever they said. It was rough. So a couple of individuals and their groups here of Ethan Allen with the Green Mountain Boys led them in New York against landowners and land speculators, said that New York authorities had no legitimacy. Oddly enough, they didn't get, executed by New York authorities over that. I guess New York, the state, or the colony, is so big that it was hard to track them down. And the Green Mountain Boys come up later as well. I was telling my class last week that, excuse me, one of the few things I remember from my young childhood is having to choose something from the Revolutionary War to write a little paper on it, and I think we had to make something out of craft paper. It was awful. I remember having getting glue all over my hands. But I did about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, in particular them storming Fort Ticonderoga and taking the cannons and delivering them to General Washington before he bombarded Boston in the Revolutionary War. So that's something that will stick with me probably forever. We also have Herman Husband. He led the Regulators in North Carolina. They actually inspired the Green Mountain Boys. And if you've played Fallout 3, the Regulators are the positive karma group you can eventually join. They would set up their own local governments, popular courts, basically in the frontier of their states, which again is just not the states, but their colonies, to essentially do what the governments would not do for the people living outside the purview of what the government was willing to do. Because the government was more interested in the cities and, what's going on the ports rather than the people living out in the dangerous areas where the natives were not happy about them being there. The Regulators got themselves killed in 1771, though. They refused to pay what they saw as unfair taxes. Granted, the taxes were being used to build a governor and ornate manor house, so, those taxes were not exactly fair. We'll actually talk more about the Regulators a little bit later. Maybe not today. We've only got a little bit of time. We'll see. All right. We will mention the Regulators again a little bit later. The Green Mountain Boys in council. A bunch of David Crockett-looking fellows. And here we have the North Carolina Regulators. The guy back here just ready to fight. Oh, yeah, this one's in the book. Okay, let's go a little further so I can try and sort of catch up with the Tuesday, Thursday class, even though they're almost done with this chapter already. I hate when they're 2 days ahead. Right. So, some common grievances after the war. Hey, look, impressment's back. Or rather, it never left. Typically, only those being impressed were the ones having to deal with it. But as I mentioned at the end of the last chapter, Merchants were joining in as well when it came to resisting. During the 7 Years' War, British cordoned off New York City, just completely like blockaded it, visiting taverns, hauling in sailors. Residents rioted at the docks, causing those in power to petition, which I know petitions are pretty minor, but hey, it's something. Even after the war, impressment continued because the British are always in need of more people in their navy, regardless of whether they're fighting or not, because eventually they're going to be fighting somebody somewhere. And obviously, as impressment continued, so did the resistance to impressment. And depending on where you were, it depended on whether or not the officials were helping you or helping the British. Some tried to uphold British policy, others tried to kind of work in the middle, and still others did work with the middle and lower classes to actually resist impressment. So I say this to kind of get the point across that I try to get the point across in most of my history classes, and that it's never black and white when it comes to one side against the other. It's never like it's all the Americans fighting together against all the British. I mean, once we get to the actual war itself, it's like a third of the colonists are actually fighting. So even here, it's like only a portion of the officials are actually like against impressment in terms of actually fighting it. Also, there was the issue of troops being stationed in colonial homes. This comes up later as like a major deal, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. This was to protect the colonists against natives and French on the borders. It was really there to keep people from resisting impressment and also to fight smuggling, because it's really hard to sneak stuff through your house when you've got soldiers living, you know, in your freaking house. And when it comes to resisting impressment, well, this guy was like, "Oh, you're not taking my buddy." He's like, "Hey, excuse me, I got me a flintlock pistol." Also, something I want to mention here. This is something we're going to see a lot of. Harper's Weekly magazine. Now, granted, this is 1882. This is from a much later thing, but I think they're talking about the press gang stuff happening back during or before the Revolutionary War. But Harper's Weekly has a lot of really good images that we're gonna steal for this class, but especially next semester. I love Harper's Weekly. Okay, this next image is in the book. I don't know how to preface it, so here it is. So the book describes it as impressment by the British. This 18th century engraving depicts the harsh impressment of men into the British Navy, set in England, because this building back here in the book, there's more to it. It's got like towers and stuff. This is an old castle. Set in England, this illustration shows that impressment was widely practiced at home. Thus, the British government did not single out colonists for special mistreatment. I bring this up for a couple of reasons. One is it's just showing more impressment. You take a truncheon and just beat people over the head and drag them off. I don't know why they're impressing a hobbit. What's going on over here? Yeah, there's a lot happening. All right, let's see if we can finish this section before we run out of time. Because we're almost done. All right. So, So people did oppose the British, especially with these specific events, but most of the time it was local, in seaport cities and whatnot. Okay. There was lack of communication, transport lines. You couldn't really have a sense of community, common purpose, because, well, stuff going on in Boston or New York, you didn't even really know about down in, say, South Carolina or even Maryland. And, well, also, you didn't even really care because that wasn't your colony and it didn't have anything to do with you. It was actually the Great Awakening that managed to bring these people together, despite, as I said, it often being about division. And as I mentioned, and again, it's the Separate Baptists was a group of traditional Baptists who split, or they split from the traditional Baptists. It's a very common thing among the Protestants. Among the Protestants, just constantly like, we don't like what's going on specifically in this denomination, but we're still not going to be a different denomination, so we're going to make our own denomination. Methodists, Dunkards, Moravians, Quakers, challenge social order, etc., etc. So, the anger that they formed against elites was able to be redirected against the British pretty easily. And as we mentioned specifically with George Whitefield, they used lines of communication and transportation to spread their word, and it was pretty easy to use these lines of communication and transportation to spread the concern about the British. So, Great Awakening, Baptist, Methodist, Democracy, World Bible, etc. All right, let me do one more slide. That's the one we'll stop on. All right, the main thing about this is that the Great Awakening was used for lines of communication. So, benign neglect is important because that was why the British had not been really messing with the colonies for a long time and made them feel like they had a lot more independence than they did, which is why smuggling, domestic manufacturing had been happening. George Grenville was the prime minister after 1763. So we have a couple acts being passed, navigation acts, prohibited smuggling because smuggling wasn't illegal already. More trade guidelines, Quartering Act, troops being kept in the colonies. This is the big one, the Sugar Act, American Duties Act, import tax on sugar, coffee, wines, luxury items, etc. So you have to pay extra money for these items to pay back for the war that Britain did, the 7 Years' War. Now, the reason that all of this pissed off the colonies is the benign neglect. They hadn't had all these taxes, whereas the rest of the British Empire had, because Britain had been concentrating on India, Australia, especially Ireland, their various island colonies, and they've just kind of been ignoring the North American colonies because they could take care of themselves. And they hadn't been dropping these taxes. So suddenly they all drop at the same time, and the colonists got all pissy and did their committee of correspondence and have their petitions and concerns and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, there's Grenville. Navigation Acts. Just another mercantilism thing. Oh, also, before you guys go, the Americans were very chill about the Navigation Acts or the Sugar Acts. As you can see here, they're definitely not, hanging an effigy of Grenville and saying there on the sign, "The folly of England and the ruin of America," and being real weird about it. And here's England making fun of their response. Anyway, we'll talk about more stuff later. I'll see you on Wednesday. Don't forget, Wednesday is when the paper is due.